On August 30th, the Globe and Mail published an editorial highlighting the fact that Canada's foreign aid spending is in decline again. They wrote, after noting that Canada's defense spending is nowhere near the NATO target, quote, "There's a similar yet lesser known international yardstick on which Canada also falls well below the collective goal, spending 0.7% of gross national income on official development assistance." The editorial goes on to conclude Ottawa needs to further bolster spending on foreign aid because, they argue, quote, "Canada's presence in the world, whether military, economic development, or humanitarian, needs to be backed up with adequate funding." So today we ask, can foreign aid be a political winner? Welcome back to inFocus with David Coletto. I'm David Coletto. On this episode of inFocus, I'm joined by Julia Anderson, the CEO at the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, or CanWaCH for short. CanWaCH has over 100 members ranging from NGOs, academic institutions, health professional associations, and individuals partnering to improve health outcomes for women and children in more than 1,000 communities worldwide. It has also been a client of mine for several years now. Joining Julia is Robert Greenhill, the Executive Chairman of Global Canada Initiative and a CG Fellow. Robert served as Managing Director and Chief Business Officer at the World Economic Forum. Prior to this, he was President and Deputy Minister of the Canadian International Development Agency and a Senior Visiting Executive with the International Development Research Centre in Ottawa. I'm thrilled to have both of these leaders on the podcast to talk about how Canada's doing today when it comes to foreign aid, what is holding us back, and explore the results of a public opinion survey Abacus data recently completed for CanWaCH on this topic. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Well, Julia and Robert, thanks so much for joining the podcast today. It's great to have both of you here. I think your experience, your breadth of kind of knowing what's going on in the world and the work that you do obviously is incredibly important. So I want to start our conversation by each of you giving us sort of your take on, where things are as you see them around the world as it relates to international development, and maybe Julia and Robert, you can speak to some of the work your organizations and you personally are kind of focused on right now. So maybe Julia, you can kick things off.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on. So we've talked a lot over the last couple of years about the 3 C's, and then I think there's a 4th C now that we've added, which is, COVID, crisis, conflict, climate, and then cost, I think is the new one that has rightfully been added as the framing for what's going on in the world. So we had COVID, and just to continue with the C's, I would add crumbling to that, right? With sort of health systems, education systems, the aftermath of COVID really causing these secondary and tertiary crises within countries. You've got debt kind of pushing in on the basic human needs in many different contexts. And then the climate crisis, which we talk a lot about. We're talking increasingly in my work with women and children's health about the intersection of the climate crisis and women's health issues, children's health issues, not just in what is the next generation going to inherit, but what actually are the conditions that are worsening in so many countries, whether you talk about pollution or other things, for people right now. So I think it's shifted from a future kind of apocalyptic problem to a today's problem, and certainly being from out west, which has been on fire since the month of June, that feels very real to me as well. And then cost. I think cost is something that Canadians are understanding in a new way with inflation. But if you take the burden of increasing costs that we're feeling the squeeze on and put that in a low-income country where the government is collapsing under debt and not able to provide for people, there's no social safety nets, there's no kind of functioning systems, and what you used to be able to purchase as an individual could get you by and no longer can. It feels like a really bleak situation out there. And we can talk about solutions and how our members are really stepping up to the challenge. But I do think that the framing of, desperate times, which I think probably resonates a little bit based on the polling with Canadians, is a fair assessment of the landscape that our 100 members are engaging in on a day-to-day basis.
In other words, it feels like your assessment is like we are worse. Would you characterize things as like things are worse off today than they may have been 5 years ago?
Yeah, and you can look at specific statistics and really see that play out. I mean, a place that Canada had tremendous leadership is in maternal health. And for many years, because of Canada and the G7 and countries governments all over the world taking maternal health more seriously, you started to see a decline in maternal mortality. So maternal mortality is describing preventable maternal deaths. So things that we know the solutions, and we just need to do them, and then people will not die. So this isn't complicated in that way. And we saw through investment that those maternal mortality rates were going down globally. And what you're seeing, if you sort of separate out certain contexts, that they're actually going up now, and going up in places. Income inequality and inequality within countries is also playing out really dramatically. So actually among many populations in the United States, maternal mortality is going up, and so you look at this, and I think, are we still probably overall making progress from 100 years ago? Are things better than they were then? Probably. But the thing that really keeps me up at night is that we have the capability to, in fact, address all of these challenges, and we just simply don't have the political will. So and that political will is decreasing. So I'm worried what those numbers are going to look like, on the statistics that I track in 10 years from now.
I can't help but react somewhat depressingly when you say, are we better off than 100 years ago? And you say, probably. Without, there's no certainty there. That to me is like a big red flashing light that on so many other things you could say, yeah, we are better off definitely than 100 years ago. But there's large parts of this world where you're saying it's not clear. Robert, I mean, from your vantage point, what are you seeing? What's keeping you up at night?
Well, I think the points that Julia raised are bang on. This is a very difficult time. I mean, we feel how difficult it is for people here in Canada, but in other parts of the world, it's absolutely critical, and bordering in some areas, like in the Sahel region of Africa, on the catastrophic. But it's worth remembering that actually we had, up until the period of COVID, 2 decades of really sustained progress. In the early 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, there was this peace dividend, which came in part by just slashing aid budgets around the world, a lot of IMF-imposed restructuring programs, and a time of extraordinary misery and going backwards on a lot of development indicators in the early 1990s. But we learned from that. Governments in the South committed to better governance. We in developed countries committed to increasing our assistance again. And there was a period of about 20 years where poverty declined to the lowest level in history globally. Polio is on the verge of being eradicated. Even killer diseases like TB, malaria, HIV/AIDS, which were out of control in the early 1990s, are down by 50% or more. So we made sustained progress. And then COVID came along, and as Julie mentioned, that caused so many challenges and stress, around the world, but in developing countries that didn't have the wherewithal to protect their populations, whose economies were already fragile, the scarring is severe. And unfortunately, some countries cynically used the COVID period to actually slash their support. So most obviously the UK, where they massively decreased funding to developing countries when they needed it most. And as we know, developing countries did not get equal access to the COVID vaccine. So that not only had a huge impact on their health and on their economy, it also had a huge impact on the relationship with the West. So there's a real sense of betrayal. So we came out of that with a real, vulnerability collectively in terms of what was going on, but also how we were perceived. And then Russia invaded Ukraine, right? And that's had huge implications because there has been channeling of aid away from the South to the very legitimate and necessary support for Ukraine. But it hasn't been additive as it should have been, both from a humanitarian and a strategic perspective. It's tended to be taking money away. So what that has done is in places like Africa, it's increased the misery, but it's also massively increased the sense of resentment. And we're seeing in the Sahel, one democratically elected government after another being basically taken out by coups with implicit, often Russian support, and massive increase of instability. So that's kind of the context we're in now, where it's not that this is inevitable. We can actually turn this around as we did in the 1990s, but the tendencies right now are negative, and it will take explicit and conscious acts of political will by Canada and other Western leaders for us to collectively turn this around, both in terms of the situation, but also in terms of the deteriorating relationship between developing countries and the West.
And I think that's such a key point, and something I want us to dig in on this podcast, because we always on this show we try to understand the sort of intersection between public opinion, politics, policymaking, and I think when it comes to international development, like it's the perfect mix where my viewpoint as someone who's outside the sector, not in it as closely as both of you, my perception is, you always hear this, international aid, ODA doesn't get votes. It doesn't win votes unless you sometimes are going to propose to cut it as opposed to spend more.
Right.
And yet, I think, and we'll talk about some of the polling we did in a moment, that what we need is actual leadership, that you don't actually hear our leaders talk about this and the interconnection between what's going on in Canada, whether that be economic risk, security risk, migration issues, and what's going on in other parts of the world. So you turn on the news, to your point, Robert, and it does feel like every week there's a coup going on in Africa, and yet the context is completely removed from that. So it's like these isolated events where people say, "Oh, a military leader has just ousted the democratically elected government," and people are cheering, and that's it, as opposed to understanding why I think we get there, and how we're can be both a problem and a solution to it. So when I look at some of the polling, and we did a pretty extensive survey in the last few weeks for CanWaCH, just trying to understand, and we've done this every so often, where the public is. And I want to preface what I'm about to say with what I believe is that on an issue like this, where we know that most Canadians unfortunately aren't paying that much attention to what's going on around the world, particularly outside of, let's say, North America or the West in particular, and with so much focus being in Europe and the invasion of Ukraine, I think taking a lot of people's attention away from other things. I still believe that what they say to me in surveys is very much based on some perceptions, but is highly influenced by what their leaders around them say, right? And so I think it's important to keep that. So, when we ask people, when you look around the world, what's the problems you see? It's very clear. Canadians understand and are concerned about what they view as kind of poverty increasing, climate change effects, and armed conflicts and war. So they aren't ignoring, or those things aren't breaking through. How could you not, I guess, is right, there.
Right.
But if you add in three others, there's broad recognition that there's a growing sense of authoritarianism, decline of democracy around the world, that terrorism, although it's not as focused anymore, I don't think you hear as much about it. People are still worried about it implicitly. And then number 6 is actually, and Julia, this probably is hopeful for you, that Canadians are concerned about the health and rights of women and children, right? Those are the 6 that kind of round out the top 3. And what we find is when we dig deeper and we say, okay, are these issues getting better or worse over time? Interestingly, and I think this is where perceptions don't match, I think, reality, people do perceive that gender inequality, spread of infectious disease, discrimination against 2S LGBTQI plus people are actually improving. That's the perception. And then on the other hand, there is deep concern and a feeling that things like poverty, climate change, cyber warfare, rising authoritarianism are getting worse, right? So there's these almost dual senses of what's going on. But what stands out is two things to me from a political perspective. Only 1 in 4 Canadians say that, global issues are a key consideration in how they vote. That's not surprising. I think any political scientist would say very rarely do any foreign affairs issue, whether it be military, humanitarian, just global affairs, plays into people's votes. But there is a broad cross-partisan, I would say, consensus that supports ODA generally. 81% of Canadians say, I support the very idea and the premise of it. Now, where our poll, I think, brings in some of the current context, people's anxiety around their own economic situation, worries about our ability as a country to pay for the things we need here, is really bubbling up. And that's this new context, right? In this cost of living crisis, people generally think we're spending enough on ODA. They want Canada to pay its fair share, whatever that means, right? So they don't want, there is a reputational and a moral, I think, understanding of what role we should play. But there's also this push and pull, and we see it very clearly in the data that at a time when people at home are feeling under pressure, the political opportunity to have a conversation about this, I think, is harder today. It doesn't mean you can't, but it's harder. And so the reasons why people think we should be giving more and be spending more on ODA is because it's the right thing to do. We're in a position to give despite the challenges we face. And there's a reputational thing. Canadians like, I think, the idea that we are moral leaders in the world and we should be leading, not following others. And then the pulls away from it are really those concerns about domestic issues. And we did pick up a little bit in this survey concerns about, corruption in receiving nations and the idea that money is not maybe going down right down to the people who need it the most. So, the overall sense I get from the polling is, there's no innate desire to see us pull back. There's, I think, an opportunity to have a conversation about why we should be doing more. And I found it fascinating. In the intro to this session, I mentioned the Globe and Mail editorial, right? Like, to me, it's like, that's something that you might see, and I don't want to, cast aspersions on the political orientations of our news organizations, but to see the Globe and Mail, right, say we need to be spending more on ODA, not declining it, I think is an indication that, at least in some circles, the connection between what's going on around the world and what happens here at home is very real. And it feels to me that at times people forget how real it was just 2 years ago when an outbreak of a disease we've never heard about completely shuts down the world. And yet 2.5 years later, we're kind of ignorant again of that fact. So I think there's opportunities. And I think the fact that you're having this conversation and we're having this conversation reflects an openness for the public to hear from their leaders. But I also think there's real threat in that anxiety that people are feeling to create political opportunity on the other side of this. So that's my sense of the polling. I'm curious, Robert, maybe start with you. Like, you saw some of those numbers, you've seen the polling that CanWaCH put out, and you've been, and I'll say, and I mentioned this in the intro, you've had this unique opportunity in that you've led the CEDA when it was CEDA, and so you've seen it from the very inside of government and how the politics and policymaking can play. What do you think the role of public opinion is in the decision-making process in government, and how these poll numbers might reflect what governments think they can do and can't do?
Well, I think as you said, David, it shows that Canadians understand that the world is interconnected. And, we shouldn't just be engaged in other parts of the world out of a sense of charity. We should also be engaged out of a sense of enlightened self-interest. Dealing with diseases abroad helps reduce diseases at home. Like, if we want to eliminate tuberculosis up in northern Canada, eliminating in other parts of the world, especially extremely drug-resistant TB, is in our interest, right? Similarly, when it comes to investing in security, whether that's through defense or whether that's through helping to stabilize societies and make them more prosperous and democratic, Climate change is an obvious one as well. So people understand the link, and people do want to pay their fair share. Canadians tend to overestimate how much they actually invest. So part of it is just saying, actually, you think we're investing our fair share. We're actually not. This government talks a good talk, but even with the very important investments they made to support the fight against COVID internationally, this government has still invested less in efficient development assistance as a share of our national economy than any government in the last 50 years. Less than the Harper government, less than the Mulroney government, less than the Trudeau senior government. So in fact, we often think we're doing more than we really are. So first of all, just say, let's do our fair share. That means we need to do more than we're doing now. The other element that is important, I think, is to make it clear, it doesn't need to be a top 3 or top 4 issue, because it's not a top 3 or top 4 spending commitment. This is a fairly modest commitment. I mean, we're talking about, do we spend 2 dimes for every $100 of national income, or 3 dimes for every $100 of national income? We're not talking about spending $5 to $6 to $7 like you would be in healthcare. So, we can actually walk and chew gum when it comes to making appropriate international commitments while actually focusing on domestic priorities. My sense is with the polling and the interviews that we did with Canadians on an exercise of foreign policy by Canadians, which we did with CanWaCH and others, was that there is the opportunity for Canadians to do their fair share on this, for Canada to step up, and Canadians will support it, particularly if political leaders explain why they're doing this and why it makes sense. So if they want to ignore it, if they choose to turn their back on the world, Canadians will probably let them get away with it, right? They're not going to force it. But if they choose to do the right thing and step up and truly be responsible for Canadians and globally, Canadians will support it. And that's what it's always been. We forget that the Marshall Plan, when it was crafted, in the mid-1940s, in the United States, after years of war, the last thing they wanted to do is spend billions of dollars elsewhere, particularly also with former enemies. And yet, Secretary of State Marshall, who had been a 5-star general, we forget, he was actually the former head of the U.S. Army, made the case, not just from a moral, but also from a geopolitical and strategic view, that by the enemy being hunger and chaos and uncertainty in Europe, and us investing in solving that, we're making the world safer for us all. That's now seen as one of the great acts of statesmanship in the 20th century. But at the time, it wasn't obvious. The polls were very uncertain, but actually Marshall and other leaders across the board, both Republicans and Democrats, made the case so that the American people understood it, and Canadians understood the equivalent that we did, and made that difference. Similarly, in the early 1950s, at the start of the Korean War, then Foreign Minister Pearson made the case in cabinet to invest in the Colombo Plan, which many Canadians don't remember, but that was the start of our international assistance program. That was providing some millions of dollars to the newly independent states of Pakistan and India when their political and societal stability was most uncertain. And Pearson made the case then, even as Canada was having to make tough decisions to ramp up for this conflict that nobody wanted on the Korean Peninsula, that we needed to find the funds to support these nascent democracies. And it played an incredibly important role and incredible dividends. Both cases were acts of conscious leadership. And in both cases, the electorate supported it. That's the condition we're in now, where if Canadian leaders, hopefully across the partisan divide in this minority parliament, agree we need to do more to stabilize the international situation, the Canadian public will be supportive.
I think to add to that, the 2 dimes or 3 dimes on your $100 is the really important thing. I think often when we set, we put trade-offs in front of people through polling, through conversation at the dinner table. These are sort of the things that come up. The idea that we have to do something here at home, or we have to do something internationally. And my entry point to every conversation, whether I'm going to go down the line of a moral argument, whether I'm going to go down the line of a strategic argument, or there's all kinds of arguments you can make about the reason for ODA that are all true. But no matter what, my opening is always, Canada has to exist in the world. Like, that's just true. We do not exist without the kind of porous borders that people, things, and money come in and out of. We have to engage in global governance structures. No matter what political stripe you are, we are a member state of the United Nations. We have to show up there, and that's good for us, can be really good for us, can be not as good for us. We can argue, but the nuance on that, but you can't argue that Canada will exist outside of the world. That just isn't true. And so then you have to say, okay, well, probably we want to maximize on some level our place in this world, right? And we really want to kind of have influence, have the ability to do things that work for Canadians and that work for the world. So, talk about China, talk about these big kind of complex geopolitical questions. All of that boils down at some level to having some influence levers to pull. And so if it's true, if we accept that it's true, Canada has to exist in the world, and then we accept that we need to make choices about what that looks like, aid and official development assistance is a really inexpensive, dimes on our $100 way to show up in the world with our values in the front, at the forefront, with a long-term generational vision of what we want to see. So we don't want the world to work only for right now. We also want it to work in 10 and 20 years. And we're, as Robert spoke to, we reaped the dividends of that. Our generation, the millennials, have reaped the dividends of that thinking from some years before, right? And so we want to be kind of long-termist in our perspective. And we want to see the world look better than it does right now, and like Canadians, as you said, the top 6 is women and children, because it's really hard. It's really easy to picture a child who just by kind of where they were born, the lottery of birth, ended up in dramatically different circumstances than the child in your own house, right? And it's easy to wrap your head around that. And I think that's why it comes up consistently, because most people have, children around them, women around them on some level. And I think I just, when politicians come back to me and say, oh, well, the only time I ever hear about international development is when I'm door knocking and people don't want it. I'm like, well, let's work on our talking points then. Like, let's work on this conversation, because to me, it's just a head scratcher. Like, it's such an easy, smart, strategic, and morally compelling kind of investment to make. Like, why wouldn't you just say, okay, like let's bring that up to 70 cents on the dollar? There's a great piece some years ago on Canada's overall global engagement. So like the Globe and Mail editorial, thanks for mentioning that. I was so happy to see that. Like that, it looked at kind of our defense spending targets, our international development targets. These are globally set targets. And this, I think it was like the size or scope of our diplomatic corps. So kind of like, how does Canada measure up when it comes to its overall global engagement, and found us failing on all levels, and really poised at that time a question about, if that's true, how do we expect to get that Security Council seat? How do we expect to go strongly into negotiations with countries like China and actually put like an influential foot forward that doesn't cost us economically and, keep people in jails? Like, that's all about influence. And if you look at every metric of the global standard and you're failing on them, it probably doesn't bode well for those conversations that you're trying to have about, being globally influential. So I think we've got to look at this, as Robert said, this isn't going to be, we're not going to have truckers, downtown Ottawa protesting because there isn't enough international development assistance. Although there's lots of people from all stripes and backgrounds that support international development, but it's never going to be, no one's going to march on Ottawa, about this. But I also think that leaders come into their state's personhood later in their terms. They look up and look out, and I'm really pushing this government to do that. And for, Prime Minister Trudeau to take it up as a personal kind of like, being on the right side of history from a legacy perspective, where we're going to look back and go, like Robert was referring to in the 90s, or like after World War II. Yeah, it felt awkward at the time to be upping aid when we were talking about cuts over here, but we got on the right side of history on this one. So I mean, I'm pushing for it. I believe that it could happen. I think it's I'm consistently disappointed from kind of all around at the small-mindedness that I see when it comes to thinking in this way, which to me just seems pretty obvious.
Well, I mean, on that point, I think Canadians generally are disappointed in the small thinking on a lot of things, right, that are going on in this world and in Canada, and feeling that there's no like plan, there's no strategy around what it is we're doing. And I think international engagement can be a key part in the story about what Canada is going to do in the next 5 to 10 years. And we just don't have that leadership. It feels like right now, right? No sense of direction, because I think Canadians will get on it if it makes sense, and you tie and you connect, choices we make here with things going on around the world. So your point really is I think reflective, of how most people are feeling. It's not just you, Julia, or Robert, who are like engaged in this every day and feeling like you can't break through the conversation. Robert, you're going to say something?
Important thing also to communicate to Canadians is not only the challenge, but the track record of success. Because many people look and say, oh, this stuff is endless and hopeless. Like, what can you do? And the fact is, international assistance has an extraordinary track record with a strong return on investment and a positive end game. So, Europe, to think that it was the basket case in 1946 and where it became by the 1950s. India, that's now hosting the G20 and is, the largest democracy in the world, with all its challenges, has come so far. And the Colombo Plan and so on is now kind of in the distant history. South Korea, where we talk about the Korean War, South Korea was for 20 years a massive recipient of aid because it was rebuilding from, tragedy and chaos. It's now, again, a democratic point of stability and is supporting much of Ukraine with non-lethal weaponry, but also helping Poland arm itself. So, there's an example of where a country, and it's also a major provider of international assistance. So a recipient has become a major donor. And I think what we need to show Canadians is, we can in the next few years eliminate polio from the planet. We can continue to push back on the onslaught of HIV, AIDS, and malaria. We could potentially in the next 20 years eliminate TB in northern Canada, but also in South Africa and elsewhere. Maybe Canada could be a real leader in that. We could play a role in helping to restabilize the very difficult situation in the Sahel. And we could, above all, potentially play a critical role in helping the people of Haiti, restore stability and progress in their country. So there are things we can do. This isn't just like, it's awful, let's pour some money into it and hope for the best. It's no, let's look at the track record of what works. Let's step up our commitment to the right level, the level that Canadians believe we're at already, which is just to do our fair share. And let's make some good things happen over the next 5 years, and then let Canadians know the role that they help play in making this happen. That's the opportunity for political leaders today.
One of the things I've been thinking a lot about and preparing for this conversation is, and I'm fascinated by what do Canadians know and how much are they exposed to things that are going on around the world. And this is kind of off your areas of expertise, but I'm curious, as you try to, you're trying to influence the conversation that's happening. And it feels to me that as journalism, and I'm going to bring journalism into this, seems to be under a great deal of pressure. Obviously, that's an understatement, I think, especially in Canada. But you hear news of, the CTV pulling back its foreign bureaus, and, there's not much coverage of what's going on in the world. And if it is, as I said earlier, it's very cursory and very shallow. It doesn't give the context. So to me, one of the things that, this is a longer term change is what can we do to support and create the environment in which people actually understand what's going on. Because I think one of the challenges we face today, and again, I wish I had, and maybe there is, and I got to go and find it, some kind of longitudinal study that shows, are Canadians today paying more or less attention to what's going around the world than, say, my grandparents' generation or my parents' generation. And it seems to me that we know that, media is more fragmented, information's more easily curated. So if you're not interested in something, you're probably not exposed to it because you don't turn on the evening news, or you're not opening a newspaper in the same way. But it seems like I'm curious your thoughts on, do you find that there is that a lack of understanding leads to a lack of empathy, which then leads to a lack of urgency, I guess, in moving this, right? You are all aware, you've mentioned multiple examples of areas in the world where we need critical focus today. And yet, if I probably said that to Canadians, they could definitely mention Ukraine, but that would maybe be it off the top of their head. So what do you see as that? Because I'm curious about the how do you build the public support and bring them along? And I think basic knowledge is a key part of that.
Yeah, I would add to your question the really important construct of trust, and who the trust in all institutions, media, government, private sector, civil society is going down. And I think that makes for a challenging situation when you're trying to get into more nuanced conversations, because they take a minute. Like, it takes a minute. If you want to talk about Haiti, if you want to talk about Canada, what Canada could do in the, to support Haiti, it takes a minute, and it takes some time, and it takes what I would think about as traditional journalism, those kind of longer forms investigative journalism, where you have a few pages to really get to the crux of a challenge and then lead people into the solutions. So I think this is a huge problem. I mean, the building empathy is about usually getting down to the story of one person. There's some great work that's done on this, of how to, in the world of impact giving, to really capture someone's attention, you're better to tell a story of one individual than of an entire community, right? And that kind of goes against, I think, where we've been going as an international development community. We've been going to the kind of a little bit higher level, how are countries faring, how are communities faring. And I wonder if getting down to the more individual stories addresses both that trust question, because it's really a person telling their own story, and kind of gets at what are the trigger points in human psychology, really. I follow Sam Harris, and he does great work on this. Like, he has a bit of a critique of it, but he accepts it as true that, you get down into someone's brain through an interpersonal connection. I think COVID and, when people probably engaged historically was when there was a war, when there was, if you talk to your grandparents' generation, like when there was a big moment that drew them out. And I think we saw that in the polling, that this moment drew people out and into the world a little bit. And I think it's how do we really capitalize on that to get to solutions, to get to the hopefulness that Robert talked about, to say we can actually do something about this. This can look different. In 5 years, it can look better, and kind of, just engage people in that way. And I think the media have a real role. Like I said, that Globe and Mail article was amazing. There's been a few on like journalists with human rights doing like this really kind of hard-hitting journalism through the Globe and the Post as well. And I think we need the media in this country to be part of this conversation, because it does create the enabling condition, because decision makers are paying attention to that as they see it as a reflection of what Canadians are interested in, as are Canadians. But I think there's a whole demographic in there that's harder to get to, and probably in the way we split out the polling, like those are the people who are actively opposed, and they're probably not, they may not be the readers, the, downtown Toronto readers of the Globe and Mail, right? And so I'm really curious about how to get to those people, not necessarily to change their mind or to make them, but actually just to increase the literacy on, because I want them as part of, again, going back to, we have to be in the world. So you, person who opposes aid, like, what's your best idea about like how we could be in the world? Because your job 100% depends on us being in the world. Your livelihood, like all these, there's no one who's not touched by Canada as a nation in the world. So like, what's your best idea, if not aid? And what are the main concerns with ODA and stuff? So I'm interested in getting to those people and the trust levers that go backwards. I think the media plays a role in that broader narrative and enabling conditions, but probably not to get to all demographics. So I think we have to have a multi-pronged strategy.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think, in addition to the traditional media, a lot of the informal outreach by influencers or by civil society organizations is extremely important. I mean, it certainly played such a positive role in the challenge, in the fight against climate change. And I think that could be adopted also for some of the issues we've been talking about in terms of international assistance. The other element I think that is a challenge is, in a sense, the business model for many humanitarian organizations, which is when there's a crisis, emphasize how awful it is. There's a earthquake here, or there's a typhoon there, or there's a disaster here, or because there's a civil war there, we need your assistance. And that makes sense because it triggers people's reaction, but it reinforces a sense that it's endless and hopeless. And it connects with the point you were making, that many Canadians think that money just goes to corrupt dictators. Well, up until this last bunch of coups, dictators were increasingly something of the past across the South. And also international development is very carefully overseen. So, there's, in any situation, in any government, there will be some leakage or corruption that needs to be addressed with, but it's carefully overseen. And also the systems put in place not only ensure that money is spent well and effectively, you can see the results, but it actually helps strengthen the overall governance systems of the countries that we're dealing with. So you can actually show to Canadians that this money actually has a positive impact. But when you look at the fundraising campaigns, all you see is a negative part. And that's, I think, where leadership comes in. It's not only say things are difficult here and here that we need to assess, but we do see that there's a tremendous positive track record. And let me just give a last one. Bangladesh. Bangladesh was looked at in the 1970s as literally the basket case, as Henry Kissinger used to refer to it. You don't hear about it much now because it's got ongoing challenges, every country does, but maternal mortality has dropped, education levels are up, it's growing at 6% a year, and in the next 2 years, it will be what's called graduating from international assistance on the World Bank. It means it will no longer be eligible for getting non-repayable grants because it's reached a level of income where it can now actually sustain itself going forward through repayable loans and other mechanisms. So it is going to be one more country, in this case, one of almost 200 million, which will have graduated successfully and have become self-reliant, which is what we all want. What a great example. And I bet you, David, you haven't heard about Bangladesh, and I bet you almost no Canadians have heard about it. And yet Canada has had a 50-year program that's really contributed to Bangladesh's success. But because it's a success, it's not part of a fundraising campaign and we don't hear about it. That's the kind of thing we all need to do more of.
Well, look, this has been, I think we could go on for many more minutes and hours probably, and I'm learning a ton from you. I think, a number of takeaways from our conversation. I think, Julia, your words of we have to be in this world, I think will stick with me, because we can't extrude ourselves or, exclude ourselves from what's going on. We, as much as we sometimes wish we can in our own personal lives and try to isolate ourselves, that's not going to happen. And Robert, your focus on, like, to your story about Bangladesh or South Korea or any of the amazing examples of that we have over the last 100 years that we could point to say, like, there's a really good return on investment, right? We sometimes, I know, and I've met with Julia and Robert, many of your colleagues in the sector, you're very, some people are very hesitant to use the language of like economists or talk about it in that way because it's so important. And there is a there is a moral side to all of this. It's the right thing to do, but we also need to connect with Canadians at the level in which they understand, the notion of return on investment and connecting people's personal concerns in their lives with what's going on around the world. I think that remains the best way to show people. And I think as much as the pandemic is now in the rearview mirror for most people, whether it should be or not, it was that moment. And we saw it in our polling during the pandemic, that people understood that the world is small and that what happens elsewhere, even someplace we've never heard of, may never visit, can't think of, put it on a map, that it could come back to us in some way and make our lives both better because, hey, maybe they produce a product we use every day. I think of South Korea, right? And the cars that we drive and all the electronics that we use in our life. Like, that is a remarkable shift in that country's contribution to the world. Not to mention the things you said, Robert. And then lastly, I think for anyone listening who, is in politics or trying to figure out, how to bring people together and build a political strategy, I think there's lessons here on how that fits into the broader story about what is Canada's role in the world. How do we use, and you use the sort of the three prongs, Julia, you mentioned, our diplomatic corps, our humanitarian and international development work, and then our military, to not just position us in a strong, effective way, but to be able to achieve the things that Canadians want to see happen in their own lives. So I think, my goal in this conversation was to get beyond sort of the usual things that we talk about when we talk about international development. And I think, and I thank you for sharing and bringing so much insight into all of this. Is there any, I guess I'll leave it, I want you to have the last word, not me. Any final thoughts on, what you take away from the conversation? Maybe I'll start with Robert and Julia will end with you.
I'll just say everything we've said and all the polls show that this is an opportunity for leaders who actually want to make a difference and want Canada to make a difference to step up at this critical point. It's not going to be forced upon them, but the polling shows they will be allowed for us to make a difference.
And I was just going to say, that's often what we see in polling, right? There's not a lot of issues in which people are cheering for something. It's more about, I'm open to hearing and lead me to the place you want me to go. Really good point, Robert. Julia.
Yeah, on a similar note, I mean, decision makers have license to do something to put Canada and, the individuals who are leading us at this moment on the right side of history, and to really make a multi-generational investment in the kind of world that Canadians want to be a part of. And if you ask any Canadian, what's the world that would be ideal for you as an individual, for your kids, for your family, they'll probably spell out the kind of world that international development is looking to build. And so I think that's the key takeaway for me, is that decision makers have license. We need a good strategy. Robert and I have endless ideas about some really smart investments. He's mentioned a few of them. Like, let's do something here. Let's do something that's really important in the world.
Can I just make one last point, David, which was, I'd mentioned the Colombo Plan and how important it was for Canada's international system. I didn't mention that it took 6 tumultuous cabinet meetings for Lester Pearson to get it through, over the strong objections of the finance minister, who, like every finance minister, thought it was unaffordable, although it was. And my point then would be to anybody of any political stripe listening to this, it's possible to make a real difference, but they'll have to fight for it and convince their colleagues, whether it's in the NDP or the Conservative or the Liberal caucus or all of them. And a minority government in some ways is perhaps the perfect time to build a cross-partisan consensus that it's in our interest to do the right thing right now, but they'll have to fight for it.
Let's fight for it. Let's get it done. Julia Anderson from CanWaCH, Robert Greenhill from Global Canada Initiative. Thank you for the time, the insights, and I hope you have, we're recording this just before the long weekend begins. I hope you have a wonderful long weekend. And to listeners, thank you for joining us. My name's David Coletto. You can subscribe to my Substack, where you'll get lots of interesting insights into polling and public policy and politics at davidcoletto.substack.com. And if you're interested in the poll that I referenced, head over to the CanWaCH website. They've got some of the details of that poll, much more than I shared here. And looking forward to connecting with you again soon. Thanks so much.